Edinburgh, one of the most famous and beautiful cities in Europe, and the capital of Scotland. I've been here many times before, but I'm always struck by just how different Scotland is from England. For although the two countries have been united now for 270 years, Edinburgh is very much the capital of another land. The heart of Edinburgh is the castle, a royal residence of Scottish kings and queens in times of trouble. And today, soldiers from famous Scottish regiments still keep guard over Scotland's greatest treasures, the oldest crown jewels in Europe. The crown, the sceptre, and the sword of state make up the honours of Scotland, as they are properly called. I asked Mr. John Wilson, Warden of the Regalia, to tell me something about them.
This is the ancient crown of Scotland. It contains approximately 3.5 pounds of Scottish gold, 94 pearls, 10 diamonds, and 33 other precious and semi-precious stones, most of which came from the Cairngorm Mountains. The pearls are freshwater pearls from the River Tay and are very rare.
That's interesting. And of course the fleur-de-lis presumably is French, isn't it? And
That's
this is a tie-up with France.
There's quite a bit of French influence and workmanship in the crown.
And I imagine it's priceless.
Oh, yes.
What about the other pieces in the case?
The sceptre is made of gilded silver with a rock crystal and a Scottish pearl. The sword of state is solid silver with a steel blade made by a great craftsman called Cellini. He only made 3 swords. There is one in the Vatican, one in Hungary, and this, the Scottish sword of state. Her Majesty the Queen knights people with the Order of the Thistle in St. Giles Cathedral with this sword.
In the wars with England, these priceless jewels had several miraculous escapes, and once were nearly lost forever when they were locked up in this chest for over 100 years. When the two countries finally stopped fighting, it was agreed that the crown should never be worn again or leave that part of the United Kingdom known as Scotland. All around the walls of the crown room are the coats of arms of the kings and queens who once wore this crown, reminding me of Scotland's ancient links with Europe, and particularly of Mary Stuart, Queen of Scots. This is her coat of arms when, as the young Queen of Scotland, she lived in exile in France. When she was 18, she returned to Scotland to claim her own kingdom, but even then retained her link with the French throne, the Lion of Scotland and the Lilies of France. The 3 Lions of England were added when it was claimed that Mary was also the rightful Queen of England. Mary reigned in Scotland for only 7 stormy years. Then she fled her war-torn kingdom, hoping to find safety with her cousin Elizabeth, the Queen of England. Instead, she found only imprisonment and death on the scaffold 19 years later. Elizabeth had no children, and her only heir was the son of her cousin Mary, whom she had executed. And so Mary's son James, who was born in this tiny room, became James VI of Scotland and James I of England, the first king of the United Kingdom. But the wars with England were not to end for nearly 200 years, and Edinburgh was too near the border for comfort and remained a poor, mean place in the shadow of the great castle. The castle bristles with guns. This one is called Mons Meg, and tradition has it that she was actually forged within the castle walls by James IV's master gunner, Robert Borthwick. And when she was in action in the 15th century, she could hurl a stone ball 3,000 yards. But this gun is a modern gun, and it's fired every day. It's called the time gun, but it's known locally as the 1 o'clock gun. Mr. Deans, it's your job to fire the gun every day, isn't it?
Yes, I do that.
Why is the gun fired?
As a signal to mariners in the fort, as tradition has it.
But I don't quite understand how the ships can hear the gun fired from as far away as they
Well,
can.
I've had no complaints, but as far as I know, they do hear it. But even then, if the mariners don't hear the gun, there is a second signal, a visual signal, which is the ball on top of Nelson Monument.
Where's that?
You can see it from here.
Oh, yeah.
The ball at the moment is resting at the bottom. It is wound up to the crossbar on the cross and dropped precisely 1 o'clock.
And that happens at the same time as the gun is fired?
Not necessarily. The gun fires British Standard Time, whereas the ball drops at Greenwich Mean Time. So during the summer hours, there is an hour of difference.
Edwin of Northumberland built the first castle here over 1,000 years ago and gave the town his name, Edwinburgh. Ever since then, a castle has stood here guarding the town and commanding the shores of this great estuary where the River Forth runs into the North Sea. At Queensferry, a few miles upstream, is the old Forth rail bridge, in its time one of the engineering wonders of the world. And beside it, there's a new marvel, the new road bridge, the longest single-span suspension bridge in Europe, which opens the way to the heart of Scotland. Because Scotland could never rely on the road south through England, she has been linked to Europe by sea. And it was from distant seas that the Norwegian whalers brought to Edinburgh something no one in Europe had ever seen before. It was a bird that couldn't fly but could swim in the sea. A penguin. I'm actually standing in the penguin enclosure in the Edinburgh Zoo with the penguin keeper, Mr. Kennedy. Hello, Mr. Kennedy.
Thank you.
When did the colony here start?
In 1914,
And how many birds was that?
6 birds.
And did they settle down fairly quickly?
Yes, they did. They actually produced a chick and bred it to maturity in 1919.
Was it unusual to breed a penguin in a zoo? Had it
Yes,
happened before?
It had never happened before. This was the very first. Edinburgh Zoo was the very first to.
Now, how many different kinds of penguins have you got?
We have 3 species at the moment.
And what are they?
The king penguin, the gentoo, and the rockhopper.
How many have you got altogether, all
We've-
3 kinds?
There's 134.
Are they tame? Could I go up?
Not really, no. They can give you quite a nasty peck, and they use the front edge of the flipper, which is very, very hard.
And they don't seem to be mixing. Is this because they don't get on the 3 different kinds of breeds?
Oh yes, they get on fairly well, but the king penguins are in that corner are breeding at the moment.
So there are some
And
young
there's-
ones over
There
there?
is, yes. There's 2 over there.
Ah. So looking around, I mean, it's all just sort of water and rock. Do they make a nest?
With the little gentoo penguins, we set up nests for them in March every year.
What do you make the nest of?
The nest consists of a concrete ring filled with large pebbles.
It's rather
And they
uncomfortable,
scoop
isn't
out
it?
the centre. In the wild, actually, the nest on pebbles and tussock grass. So it is quite natural for them to nest on pebbles.
Now, they're very clumsy, funny birds, aren't they, on land?
They
What
are
are they like
they're-
in the water?
So they're very, very fast. They've recorded speeds of 22.5 miles an hour.
Do you have any special time for feeding them every day?
We feed them at 3:45 every day after the penguin walk.
A penguin walk is what?
Actually, it started by accident. One of the keepers left the gate unopened accidentally, and it was a very busy summer afternoon, and 1 or 2 of the penguins managed to walk out into the public part of the park, and it didn't seem to upset the public, and the public didn't upset them, so they started to make a feature of it. We never force anybody out, it's all only volunteers.
Do most of them go?
Because thick in the moult, they don't seem to want to go out, or at breeding times.
I notice that some of these are molting at the moment. They're looking very scruffy, aren't they?
They are, yes.
How long does the molting season last?
Approximately a month to 6 weeks.
Some of them are beginning to guess it's penguin parade time. Can I come on the walk with them?
Certainly can, yes.
Let's go then. another famous walk, the Meadows. And this is a very famous game. This is golf. It's Scotland's national game, and certainly everybody seems to play it. Its beginnings seem lost in time, but James IV and James V, the grandfather and father of Mary, Queen of Scots, both played, and Mary herself was a keen golfer who practiced frequently here on this 18-hole course which still exists and is much used right in the middle of the city. Every year, full-scale competitions are held, open to golfers of all ages. Everybody get it in the hole that time?
Yes.
Oh, jolly good. Do you come here every day?
Well,
That's during the holidays, of course.
Yeah.
Isn't it? Are these your own clubs you play with, or have you borrowed your dad's?
No, got their own.
How long have you all been playing?
Years.
Who wants to be a famous golfer when they grow up?
The footballer.
Three of you want to be golfers.
The second Trevino.
Well, that's quite an ambition to have. Do you have to pay to play here, or can you do it for free?
You just bring your own club and you get on for nothing. Or there's a putting green for the river. There's putting green up there where you can...
Presumably you've got to bring your own balls and your own tees as well. Do you want to be a golfer when you grow up?
No.
You don't? What do you want to be?
Tail diver.
A what diver? A pearl diver? Oh, that sounds an interesting job to do. Shall I have a go?
Yes.
Go on. Let's see how... What's that one called?
It's a putter.
A putter.
Yeah.
See, I don't know much about golf. Where do I stand? About here?
Yeah.
Do I use a putter for this hole?
Yes.
Ah, am I holding it right?
Yeah.
Is that right?
That
Right.
dot ends up with a ball.
With the ball, like that. Is that right? Does it matter that I haven't got a little tee?
No, you don't have tees on there.
In Scotland, golf has never been a game for the exclusive few, but is played by rich and poor, old and young. Originally, the meadows lay just outside the old city wall, and in those days they were a burial ground for plague victims. And just beyond lies the medical school. Edinburgh had one of the earliest and most famous schools of medicine in the world. Its reputation today is still enormous. But back in 1828, a scandal took place that shook Edinburgh and rocked the medical world. It began with Dr. Robert Knox, one of the leading lecturers in anatomy in Edinburgh. Students flocked to his classes in lecture rooms just like this. The lecture rooms were like vast horseshoes. They were built like this to enable as many students as possible to see, and to see well. Perhaps as many as 500 at a time would pack themselves in, especially if it was someone like Dr. Knox who was speaking. For his lectures, Dr. Knox needed bodies to dissect, and bodies were becoming very hard to obtain. It was about 400 years earlier that anatomists had first started giving demonstrations. They were given the bodies of condemned criminals to cut up, but there simply weren't enough of them, and so a hideous trade developed, grave robbing. Several of the churches in Edinburgh have watchtowers and mort safes where a guard would be set at night to prevent men opening the grave, stealing the body, and then selling it to the anatomists. The men who did this were called the body snatchers, the resurrectionists, or the sack-em-up men. And when they'd robbed the grave, they sold the body to the anatomist for quite a considerable sum of money. Some of them became so skillful at their gruesome work that it was impossible to tell the grave had even been robbed. And for a while, society and the law shut its eyes to the problem. At the time that Dr. Knox was giving his lectures, an Irishman, William Hare, kept a lodging house near Tanner's Close. One day, one of his lodgers, an old soldier, died owing him money. Hare talked to another lodger called Burke and told him that he was going to take the body to the doctors. They'd give him some money for it and it would help to pay off the debt. So that night, Burke and Hare took the body in a sack to the doctors and were paid £7 10 shillings in gold. To Burke, it was an eye-opener. He saw a road to riches, easier than work, far safer than grave robbing. The demand was there, and he would supply it. They turned to murder. For a nightmare year, Burke and Hare ran their hideous trade. People were either kidnapped or lured to the lodging house. People who would not be missed and about whom no questions would be asked. And then at night, on a handcart, the body would be trundled across Edinburgh to the doctors. Fear and suspicion grew to whispers. Whispers grew to rhymes. Up the close and down the stair, Butt and Ben with Burke and Hare. Burke's the butcher, Hare's the thief, Knock's the boy that buys the beef. Then, one gloomy day in November, it all happened just once too often. The police arrived and searched Hare's lodging house. The bodies on the dissecting table were examined. Burke and Hare were arrested and flung into prison. But even now, there was not enough evidence against them. So Hare was persuaded to turn King's evidence. He was promised that if he told everything he knew about Burke, he himself would be allowed to go completely free. The trial of William Burke the murderer took place in the courthouse in Parliament Close on December the 24th, Christmas Eve, 1828. He was said to have committed 16 murders, and the chief witness against him was his ally and accomplice, William Hare. The next day, Christmas Day, Burke was condemned to death and his body ordered to be dissected. 1 month later, he was hanged before an enormous crowd and his body duly given to the doctors. And this is his skeleton. Hare fled to London and was never heard of again. And so a brief but ghastly episode was over. But the reputation of the medical profession quickly recovered, and today the city is one of the world's great medical centres. The arts and sciences have always flourished in Edinburgh. Behind me is the house that belonged to a man called Patrick Geddes, and right at the top of the house is his fascinating invention, the camera obscura. Geddes had planned a centre of research into geography and physics here. But now people only come to see this extraordinary view of Edinburgh below. The pictures are better in good weather, but even on a dull day it's pretty busy. Charles, how does the camera obscura work?
It's a very simple system, actually. It's operated by a revolving mirror up at the top of our tower. This handle revolves the mirror, and you can see the picture moving around there. And the mirror reflects an image through a series of lenses. And what you see on the table is an image of Edinburgh as it is at any present time.
And when was this invented?
Well, there's been a camera obscura here since 1892. It was founded by Sir Patrick Geddes. The system of operation was the same then, basically, except that instead of a handle, it was a pulley at that time. But this present equipment was put in 1954.
So was the first camera obscura in Edinburgh, or were there other ones before that somewhere else?
Well, I wouldn't like to say that, but there are very few camera obscuras around anywhere in the world. And I do think this is the best one.
To see Edinburgh, you really do have to get up high. Running down from the castle is the city's most famous street, in fact one of Europe's famous streets, the Royal Mile. It was here that the old town of Edinburgh grew up, protected by a defensive wall to the south. Along this narrow hogback of rock, much of Scotland's violent history was written, and most of its famous people lived. The most remarkable thing is that there were no public buildings or grand houses. Edinburgh was too close to England for safety. At the bottom of the mile is the Palace of Holyrood, the seat of the Stuart kings and queens. It was from here that they ruled their turbulent country. And it was here that Mary, Queen of Scots, arrived back from exile as a young girl, with such high hopes for the Stuarts and Scotland. But space inside the wall was scarce. The only way to build was up, so up they went. They built of stone, 6, 7, 8 stories high, the first skyscrapers in Europe, and 400 years before New York. Lands is the old Scottish word for these buildings. The ground floor was reserved for the cattle and pigs, and at one time there were 27,000 of them. Above that, the nobility, gentry and common folk all lived on top of each other and shared a common stair. The skyline became an extravaganza of thrusting towers and gables. The Scottish peers had their grand town houses in the Mile, but when Scotland and England united, the Scottish peers left Edinburgh for London, and Edinburgh's prosperity went with them. The glittering and colourful Royal Mile became a mile-long slum. Edinburgh became a mean, overcrowded city, choked with houses. One day, the side wall of a building 6 stories high collapsed. Not many people were killed, but everyone had had enough. The citizens of Edinburgh decided to build a new town. And here it is, the new town that they built. They begged and borrowed money, engaged architects, and drew up plans. They drained the castle lock. They got an Act of Parliament to extend the boundaries of the city. And suddenly, this poor, mean, little-known capital became the very model for town planning. Gone were the narrow, twisting winds of the old town. Here were broad streets, handsome squares, and beautiful gardens. The new Edinburgh became known as the Athens of the North, and today is not only one of the most beautiful cities in Europe, but a thriving centre for banking, law, and education. And they built statues to the men who lived and worked here, like Sir Walter Scott, the novelist, who in fact found the long-lost crown jewels. To the king, who helped make their plans possible and visited the city. The Scots Greys, who made their famous charge at Waterloo. And to their leading citizens like Provost Black, Edinburgh is full of statues. This is perhaps the most remarkable statue of all, Grey Friars Bobby, a little Skye Terrier who could not forget his master. He was a real dog, and he lived on a farm just south of Edinburgh. Bobby spent all his time out on the hills with the farm shepherd, Old Jock. Every Wednesday he would follow Old Jock into Edinburgh to the sheep market. When the 1 o'clock gun sounded up in the castle, the shepherd and his dog would go to Grey Friars' dining rooms kept by a Mr. Trail. Jock would buy a meal, and Mr. Trail always found something for Bobby too. When the old shepherd retired, he took lodgings in Edinburgh. Bobby remained on the farm, but he was so miserable without his friend that one night he escaped from the farm and made his way back to the city. He searched for Jock in all the places he knew, and at last he discovered him, sleeping in a close near the grass market. Bobby was overjoyed, but Old Jock was very ill. Days later, Old Jock was found in an attic room, dead. His Bible with his name in it lay beside him, and Bobby crouched down by his bed, guarding the old shepherd's body. Old Jock was buried in Greyfriars churchyard in this very spot where this headstone stands now. 3 days after his funeral, as the sound of the 1 o'clock gun died away from the castle, a worn, distressed little dog hurried into Trail's dining rooms. Mr. Trail called to him and put down a plate of food, but Bobby just snatched the food up and rushed away. This happened in exactly the same way for 3 days, and at last Mr. Trail decided to follow him to see where he went. Bobby led him to Old Jock's grave. The little dog was living in the churchyard, going each night to lie on the grave. And there he stayed for 9 years. Mr. Trail fed him every day at 1 o'clock, and all the children made friends with him. And if it was cold or wet, Bobby used to shelter underneath here. But then officials began to ask questions. Who did Bobby belong to? Had he got a collar? Who paid his license, or hadn't he got one? Mr. Trail was accused of encouraging stray dogs, and the case came to the ears of Edinburgh's Lord Provost. He was so impressed by the loyalty of the little dog that he gave Bobby the freedom of the city, the highest honour that the city could bestow, and the Lord Provost bought him this collar, and on it says, Greyfriars Bobby, from the Lord Provost, 1867, licensed. Bobby became famous, and in his later years he became one of the sights of Edinburgh. And when he died, he was at least 22 years old. Bobby was buried here, a freeman of the city and among the famous. Extraordinary to think of a dog being a freeman of the capital of Scotland and going to have his lunch each day in a pub. There are pubs all over Edinburgh, and they all have one thing in common, bottles and bottles of whiskey. Before coming to Scotland, I thought whiskey was just whiskey, This is the 37 bar, where Mr. George Robertson says he has 50 different brands of Scotch. Mr. Robertson, have you got all the different kinds of whisky that are made?
Oh, no, I think it'd be impossible to keep them all. There are over 2,000 brands of Scotch whisky, and we pride ourselves in keeping 50.
You've got something up there that says on the bar, measure used in this bar, quarter of a gill. Does this mean you serve a different measure from other bars, or?
Well, we pride ourselves in giving the good old Scotch measure, quarter gill. In England, you get a much smaller amount, and when a Scotsman goes to England and asks for whisky, I think they usually do is ask for a double whisky. Their small measures are no good to Scotsmen.
And do Scotsmen really drink as much whisky as it's claimed?
Oh, yes, they do, really. They'll like, that's the wine of the country, of course, and they like the wine of the country.
The Edinburgh Festival of Music and Arts, lasting 3 weeks in August and September, was started 25 years ago. It's a tremendous idea, and visitors from every corner of the world pour into the city to enjoy the best orchestras, musicians, conductors, singers, dancers and actors who come to perform in Edinburgh. For 3 weeks, this quiet, sedate city becomes the cultural capital of the world. Alongside the official festival, another festival has grown up, which has become almost as famous. The Fringe. Trendy, youthful, experimental, and often disrespectful. But in all this galaxy of international culture and new thinking, throughout the festival, the greatest, the most popular, the most sold-out attraction remains obstinately Scottish and traditional. The floodlit tattoo on the esplanade of the castle. At night, the castle floats like a fairy castle above Princes Street, while the Scottish regiments dance and the pipes play. Tunes that Scottish regiments have danced and marched to for too long to remember. Tunes with titles like Scotland the Brave, The Nut Brown Maiden, and The Black Bear. Surprisingly, the bagpipes are just about the one thing the Scots can't claim to have invented. Bagpipes came from the East, but the Scots certainly have made them their own. They've been making them in this shop just beside the castle for nearly 200 years. Hello, Mr. Ross. What are you making here?
That is a mouthpiece for the bagpipes.
And what's it made out of?
That is made of art ivory, that. The other one I'm making is real ivory.
Beautifully smooth, isn't it?
It's modern art ivory, of course, which is impervious to damp, an important thing, and heat.
Where in the East did the bagpipes first come from?
The bagpipes were really, they were into Europe before the bag was added. From ancient China for 4,500 years before, the bagpipe as such was unknown, and I never could understand how the Chinese, so clever as they were, never thought of adding a bag.
Well, who were the first people to add the bag?
I think it is about the Turks, and the Turks were the first and most important people in martial musical instrument in the old days, and marching. I think it was them who really started the bag, and from there it went all over Europe.
So bagpipes are throughout the world?
All over the world, yes, but none of them have brought them to a stitch of standard perfection, the same as the Highland bagpipes.
When did they first arrive in Scotland?
You can't tell a date. There wasn't a date like the invention of the typewriter.
Well, why do you think